Well, may I first of all welcome both to those who are physically present here today at the University of Malaya and those who are joining us online for a talk today by Dr. Christopher Joll, who is an anthropologist currently with Victoria University of Wellington, where he is a research fellow. He's also a fellow of the Chulalongkorn University, with ties also to UKM. He's spent 17 years in southern Thailand, and his research interests are interdisciplinary: anthropology, history, theology, and transnational relations between Thailand and Malaysia. He's written very extensively on these subjects, and this is the last, as far as we know, of a series of whirlwind talks. He tells me he's done 3 talks in the last, not sure whether it's 2.5 or 3 days, and this is the 4th, including Monash University here in Malaysia, Nottingham, and the University of Malaya up in Kelantan. So he's been whizzing around quite a bit. He will be speaking to us today on, and let's get the title right, British Plans to Annex the Siamese-Malay Peninsula, a longue durée of competitive colonialisms between the 19th century and the early 1950s. So, Chris, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lovely to be here. Nice to see you all physically in the room as well as on the screen. Let me just jump in. Now, we are aiming, Henry will nudge me under the table, but I'm aiming for 45 minutes, is that right? Okay, so let's aim for 45 minutes. And yes, let's get going. So, a very brief introduction from me. This is this talk is one of a series of talks that I've undertaken to give while in Southeast Asia over the last 3 weeks. I was in Patani, and today is my last day in KL before going to Indonesia tomorrow. And it is the initial, this is very much a work in process, but it has come out of some work that I've been doing since about June last year, when Henry and Richard contacted me expressing their interest in me writing a series of articles looking at the topic, which is the subject of today's talk. And I've taken various sub-themes and presented them elsewhere, and this is my first attempt at presenting my analysis of on and off plans by various members of the British colonial apparatus that sought to change the political geography of specifically Peninsula, what was then Siam, and that is where we're going. But before we do that, and I've got to just work out how to go to the next slide. I press that button. Okay, there's something wrong. I press that button. Do we have some help? I've pressed enter and nothing has happened. Okay, here we go. So here we go. So what are we trying to do here? I can't read everything on my screen, but what we're wanting to do is this. I'm wanting to reconstruct British plans to annex part of the Siamese Peninsula between 1786 and the 1950s. So that's the period. So that's the why, the what, the who, the when, the where, the how. But we're wanting to do more than that. I don't think that anyone is particularly interested in a long gallop, an exhausting gallop between the who, what, when. On this year, this person did this, and it's important for these sorts of reasons. So in addition to, although I start with reconstructing British plans, what I'm wanting to make sure that we have adequate time to deal with is the equally important so what questions. Why is this important? And specifically what the contemporary relevance of some of these events are. And below the so what in big beautiful orange letters is a frightfully unappetizing thin bones broth. So, you know, I think that, you know, Henry and Rich and I have had a number of yarns over WhatsApp. And I think initially I said, oh, mate, I'm from New Zealand. I'm not from Australia. I said, oh, mate, I kind of think everything's been picked over, eh? I'm not really sure that there's that much to tell. And I'm not really interested in serving up some sort of thin, bland bone broth. I'm not interested in doing that. But as I started work on this, I really am increasingly confident that there is a new story to tell. And I'll talk a little about my approach soon. But before doing that, very briefly, I think it's important that I take just a couple of minutes to remind us all about the general context in which I am writing from, okay? So I lived for 10 years in Patani in South Thailand, starting from July 2000. Since, in a couple of months, mid-late April 2004, the security situation in the Malay-dominated 3 southern provinces of Patani, Yala and Narathiwat dramatically downgraded, and you'll see a number of numbers there. You'll see a graph of the last 10 years with a spike in 2007. So since April 2004, there's been over 21,000 incidences that have led to approximately 21,000 casualties, and more importantly, over 7,000 deaths. And this is a very concerning, long, intractable subnational conflict right on Malaysia's back door. So that is the first part of my background of the context of the study, the context of me having lived there for a long time and elsewhere in Thailand for 10 years after that. The second comment I wanted to make, and again, equally briefly, so the doctoral work that I did at University of Kebangsaan, that I graduated, I finished my PhD in 2009, and I published my monograph, Muslim Merit Making in Thailand's Far South with Springer, in 2011. So that's an important part of my background and a way of establishing my credibility for saying something sensible about all of the developments that we'll be tending to soon. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is this, that I'm originally from New Zealand. Those of you who don't know the difference between an Australian accent and a New Zealand accent will know immediately I'm not an Australian. If you want to offend me, call me Australian, feel very free to do that. But an important part of our heritage in New Zealand is a treaty that was signed between the English Crown and a confederation of Maori chiefs in 1840. And this was called the Treaty of Waitangi. And in the 1970s, and these clarified issues of autonomy, of sovereignty, of protection, and between 1840, after 1840, on and off, through the rest of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there were actions on behalf of the Crown that were interpreted by the Maoris as a violation of the treaty. In the 1970s, the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal was established that provided the legal framework through which Maori tribes could make official claims against the Crown for violations of the treaty that led to a loss of land. And this initiated a process where the Treaty of Waitangi would commission historians to go into the archives and to record what the archives tell us about what actually happened. And obviously, anyone who is an historian realizes the importance of sticking close to the sources as possible. Sources are more important than stories. And so this has led to there have been a number of important outcomes of the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, and I haven't got time to talk about this in detail, But there is enormous dignity when people who feel that they have been, they have suffered at the hands of a series of governments, and to be listened to, and for claims to be researched. This is very much where I'm coming from in terms of a heartbeat to do this head work. I do believe that there's a real need for this sort of work to be done in South Thailand, documenting what actually happened. Okay, here we go. So a friend of mine once said, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Another person said, PowerPoint presentations make for powerless and pointless presentations. So unfortunately, because of the nature of the hybrid format, it's important that I do prepare some PowerPoint slides. And what I have done is I've tried to develop a series of infographics which summarize. So we will have a few quotes that you may or may not enjoy reading, but I'm emphasizing a series of infographics which visualize developments that happened between 1786 and around the time of the Bangkok Treaty in the 1870s, and I call that the century of conflict, leases, and treaties. This is followed by what I refer to as the decades of competitive colonialisms, particularly between the Siamese and the English, but also the Siamese and the French. And of course, this was a non-love triangle. I'm not sure there's probably a better term to talk about the relationship between the French, the English, and the Siamese during this period. After relatively uneventful decades, we have the Second World War and then the beginning of the Cold War. So the series of infographics that I will be introducing are based on this, and at the bottom there we have a series of kings. I'm just going to refer to Ramaning, Ramasong, Ramasam, Ramaha, which is the name of the kings, the most important of which arguably is Lalongkong, who is the 5th king in the present Chakri dynasty. Okay.
Cool.
So I'm going to be developing a number of themes, and I'm going to be talking about the who, what, when, and why, but I'm going to be emphasizing the themes that develop in my initial analysis of plans over this longue durée. Justifications for annexation, the spoilers and sponsors of annexation, the significance of the cartographic record in terms of perceptions of the peninsula, concessions, and establishing a physical presence on the peninsula, as well as the role of print media. Okay, and so the first of a series of slides summarizing developments in this first century of conflict, leases, and treaties is on the screen now. Between 1786 and 1838, the first 3 Siamese kings were engaged in a process of subjugating all of the vassal states to the north and to the south. And in the south, it was Kedah on the west coast, and the Patani states on the east coast. Kelantan and Terengganu weren't really that involved, although the Raja of Kelantan was asked to provide some troops to some of the campaigns. So we've got a series of campaigns on the west coast, on the east coast, between 1786 and 1838. That spilled over to 1839, but basically all of the fighting was over by then. If you're wanting to read about this, Francis Bradley's The Forging of Islamic Power is highly recommended. I'm going to be referring to another book which has been edited by Cyril Skinner. Skinner wrote a number of monographs, including published by the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And so I want to just make a number of very short but important points. That there was an understanding from Bangkok that by the 1840s that they had successfully militarily subjugated the peninsula. And this is indicated in a number of ways. One is that the coat of arms, and I've got an example of the coat of arms here. This is used during the reign of King Chulalongkorn, and it includes on the bottom left-hand corner a two gris with the pink background there. And a very, very interesting anecdote in Cyril Skinner's work on the civil war in Kelantan is that he mentions that the warring parties in the civil war of Kelantan in the 1840s, they approached Bangkok to resolve the conflict, and Bangkok appointed one of the rivals to become the Raja of Patani, and he established what is called the Jabatiko dynasty in the history of the Malay Kerajaan of Patani. And it's also important to add that I've started in the 19th century for a number of important reasons. And here are a few quotes from the mouth of Ramasam, the third king of the Chakri dynasty, as recorded by his secretary, Luang Urum Sombat. And he said, Ramasam, the king said, if we abandon Kedah, we would be losing a considerable source of revenue, and the British would pick it up and annex it, and we can't treat the matter lightly. Later on in July the 28th, 1839, 3/4 of the population have gone over into British territory. Later on, and just a couple of days later, Ramasam's treasurer was sent to the south to divide Kedah into districts under headmen on the Patani model. He added that Kedah was different from Patani given its proximity to the straits. It should be straight, not straight settlement. The strait settlements. Malay elites were living there, and if things are bungled, it will give them the opportunity to conspire with the British, to have the British act as the agents in pressing their claims. This will lead to the loss of Kedah. So right back in the 19th century, the kings in Bangkok was aware of not only the threat of the British with their operational base from Province Worsley, Pulau Penang, as well as in Patani. So arguably at that stage, the problem was more with the West Coast. Okay, so that's number one done. So you see that I've numbered these developments. Second of all, and I hope you don't mind me just going along at a reasonably fast clip, because this is just a who, what, where, when. And actually nothing, you don't have to listen to what I say, so you can turn on a podcast, put your earphones in. But after this, I want to juxtapose, and this is really the most important element of my approach to reconstructing this period, to be talking about what was going on the Siamese side, what was going on the British side, and to be pointed out that the British side wasn't just one constituency, one party, and the same actually is true on the Siamese side. So you know the history, for goodness sake, I'm at UM, the history of the history department at UM. So I don't need to tell you about what happened in 1786 and then 1800 and 1824. Maybe might need to remind you that in 1826, the Bowring Treaty was signed with Ramasam in Bangkok. That was Henry Bowring. There were changes in the administrative structure. You know, we have the East India Company, then we have the British Straits Settlements, and then we have the British East India Company, and then we have the Indian Office and the Colonial Office. All those details you know better than me. We have the conclusion of the Second Anglo-Burmese War, and actually in 1855 we've also got the Bowring. 1826 should be the Burney Treaty. 1855 should be the Bowring Treaty, concerned with the issue of free trade. We must remember that in this period, there was an interest in free trade. Later on, we're going to be talking about free land. Well, not free land, but cheap land, concessions of large tracts of land. So that is a very whistle-stop summary of what was going on the British side during this century of conflict, leases, and treaties. It might be good to for us just to, we're waiting for the slide to come up next. And so it may be good for us to just keep the pace going. So during the reign of King Chulalongkorn, he was initially a regent, and then he was, at the death of his father, he became the regent. And when he was when he was coronated again, he reigned until 1910. And I've referred to these decades as the decades of competitive colonialisms. And I've restricted myself to developments, particularly in the 1890s. And during the 1890s, some of the arguably the most important personalities for people to have on their radar, King Chulalongkorn himself, he's on the left there, the last king of Patani, that is Tunku Abdul Qadir Gamarudin, and Sir Frank Swinningham, and Henry's written a lovely book on that, and he was very kind in sending me portions of his monograph for me to read, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to do that. During these decades, there were a number of developments. There were developments in terms of the entry of the French to the north and the northeast of Siam that created anxiety between Penang and Singapore, and we have the start of rapid modernization reforms in 1892, referred to as the Tetsabiban reforms. And central to the Tetsabiban reforms was the modernization of the administration of all of the provinces under Bangkok, including in the south. So initially, Patani came under Monton Nakhonsi Tamarat. There was Kelantan and Terengganu to the south, there was Kedah to the west, and then north of present-day Kedah, there was Monton Phuket that went all the way up to the southern border of British Burma. There was gunboat diplomacy, with the French coming to the entrance of the WWII River in Bangkok, that led to the loss of territories east of the Mekong River. Anglo-Siamese Convention in 1896, a secret convention between the Foreign Office and the Siamese, where it was agreed that no rival European power would be given concessions south of the narrowest Siamese part of the peninsula, in present-day Prachuap Khiri Khan, just north of Chumpon. Monton Patani was established in 1906, but before then, the last Sultan of Patani was arrested for subordination, for refusing to cooperate with the modernization of a territory that he had ruled over as a traditional Malay ruler, where he was able to collect taxes, he was able to be involved in giving judgments in local courts. He was finally marginalized. The Malay Garaja under Patani was no more, and the Siamese-Kelantan Treaty was signed, whereby British advisors were able to work in Kelantan, and concessions being given to British firms, the most important of which was the Duff Company. So in 1891, in his journal, Chulalongkorn wrote these words: "We have no particular interest in the Malay states, aside from having the Malay states as an outer province of the kingdom bordering Westerners." Now, it's a bit unclear. This is really frustrating. It is not clear what the Siamese mean when they talk about the Siamese-Malay states. So British sources talk about Siamese-Malay states, and it usually refers to Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, and Burles. Now, some people would say that includes Patani as well, but this is just, and this is normal. This is a very common phenomenon where people they refer to particular places, and it's not particularly clear about what is meant. It depends on the source and the period. Rather frustrating. But we have no particular interest in these places. If we lose the states to the British, we suffer no material loss except the bunga mas, which is not of great value. However, I feel it would be a loss of honor for the kingdom. Therefore, I want to see it to be a stable place to protect against this occurrence. Now, on the basis of what he says at the end, I'm assuming this includes Patani. An important quote. Okay, just again, a bit of a reminder, and this is a little one of the nuggets from your monograph, your treatment of Swettenham. The map on the left is a summary of what British territories were acquired in Burma and in the unfederated Malay states, the Strait settlements and all the rest. On the right, on the north to the northeast, the French territories that are acquired. The hue is related to the time period that these were acquired. We see British and French spheres of influences. So there was a rogue prince, a cousin of Duke of Longkong, who worked for Sir Frank Swettenham in Perak, and he was interviewed by Swettenham, who sent this report to the Colonial Office, I think, in July 1892. And he says that the Siamese government has told him they wish to claim as much as they could, whether on the French side or the Malay Peninsula, and hold on to it as long as possible, with the idea that someday they might save Siam as or some part of it by throwing these outlying provinces one by one to the pursuers, French on one side and the English on the other. And so that's part of the record in 1892. Okay, so let's move on. So that's a very short summary of developments during the decades of competitive colonialisms between both the Siamese and the French, and the Siamese and the English and the French for that matter. The other time where we read of specific plans initiated by the British to annex portions of the peninsula are in the years and the months immediately before the start of the war in Southeast Asia, with the Japanese invasion of southern Thailand, from which they spilled off to Penang and down eventually to Singapore. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a map from the Foreign Office, and it provides details about the line roughly between Langkawi, is it Langkawi, is it Penang? Across the peninsula, starting on the east coast, Senggora or Songkhla, present-day Songkhla. And so this was called Operation Matador, and the details about under which this defense of the peninsula by the British, should there be a Japanese invasion of Siam, we haven't got time to talk about all of the details of that, but basically there was a lack of appreciation at the speed at which the Japanese were able to enter the peninsula and to move south. There was a reluctance on the British to be occupying a portion of the Siamese Peninsula if there hadn't been a declaration of war. And so there's been a number of people who have analysed these developments, and I've got the cover of one of the most authoritative. And so this the picture there is a picture propaganda telling people that People Songkhram, who was the military ruler during the fascist, the first of his very, very unpleasant right-wing government. He's shaking hands with an unnamed Japanese general. Basically, the Thai tells us that cooperation with the Japanese has led to the protection, salvation of Siam, of Thailand as it was called then, and that if we had shaken hands with Winston Churchill, the country would have been ruined. So this is a, yeah. And so I also want to mention the important personality of Tunku Mahmud Mahidin. And he was the son of the last Sultan of Patani that I've mentioned just before, Tunku Abdul Qadir Gamaruddin. So his son, he was educated initially actually in Bangkok, and then he was sent to Penang, and he shifted to Kelantan. He had a business there, and he volunteered into Force 136 when the Japanese invaded. He was decorated for gallantry, helping respond to the sinking of a British ship. He was co-opted by the British. He was taken to India, where he produced radio programs. He was actually taken to Mecca by the English. There's been the secondary literature referred to a number of claims made about what was said and done. The general assumption is that at some stage, members of the British military authority made promises to Tunku Mahmud Mahideen that after the war, the British would see that the Siamese would be punished for their cooperation with the Japanese, and that the Malays, the Patani states, would join the unfederated Malay states. This did not happen for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about those a bit later. Important to note, 1941, the Atlantic Charter, and the Cairo Conference of 1943, where sometimes uneasy allies, the Americans and the British. We've got Mountbatten, who was involved in the SEAC. Some people say that the SEAC was short for Save England's Asian Colonies. That may or may not be the case, but probably not. We've got Eden, who was Churchill's right-hand man, and then we've got Roosevelt. During the war, the SOE and the OSS were both involved in clandestine operations. So these were uneasy allies. If we interact with the secondary literature, we see repeated references to some uneasy dynamics between these two. The fifth, I just want to read this now. This is immediately after the Second World War. Okay, so let's not do this in order. Let's just have a look at this badge. So this badge here is the badge of one of the first ethno-nationalist movements that was established by members of the Malay elites in the years after the Second World War. And isn't this remarkable? We have a Malay organization established around 1948, where we have the crown of the King of England with the cross on it, as well as the crest, as well as, yes, I think this is remarkable. This is quite remarkable. And this is the work of an excellent master's thesis done by a student at Cambridge University. So the son of the former Raja of Talupan, or Saiburi, submitted a petition to Churchill via the Supreme Commander of the BMA in November 1945, saying the state of Patani was always a Malay state under the government of Malay Rajas. The Siamese have only governed it for about 50 years. Now the United Nations ought to help the Malay race to become one federation with the Malay states of the peninsula. And later on in July 1948, earlier in 1948, the Secretary of Gimba sent a letter to the Kelantan police. He enclosed samples of the flag and the badge of the new government of Patani Legeh, Yala and Satun, and called upon officers to acknowledge that Patani Malays wearing this badge were under protection of the British. They should therefore not be molested, but assisted. So we know that there were a number of significant developments immediately after the Japanese surrender. There were attempts by the British to annex the Malay states, but the Americans would not have a bar of it, and they cited the Atlantic Treaty, the Atlantic Charter. But there are a number of interesting quotes, argy-bargy, between Churchill and Roosevelt. Significantly, once the Malayan emergency really kicked off, by that stage, decisions about whether the Siamese would be fined or the Siamese would have to hand over rice surpluses that would feed colonies, all of those details had been sorted out. And then, significantly, the security situation in Malaya deteriorated. The announcement of the emergency. Now, the significance of this is that the British needed the cooperation of the Siamese in order to prevent communist elements from making headway. And so I've done ethnographic research on some of the invulnerability cults, the Ilmunggabao cults that were in Naratiwat around that time, influenced by Johor and Kiai Saleh from during the Japanese occupation. So I know this period reasonably well. Obviously, Roosevelt died. It was replaced by Dwight Eisenhower, and the last institution involved in this reconstruction of British plans was the establishment of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that again revisited the possibility of basically repeating Operation Matador, establishing some sort of military presence on the peninsula to protect British Malaya. However, they were unable to get that through because the Siamese were more interested in assistance in protecting all of the country, the most important part of which was Bangkok, not having only having a presence in the south that was obviously not going to be serving their needs. And as they say, the rest is history. So that's the who, what, when, where, and all the rest. What I want to do is keeping up the pace, and please do keep notes in your head or on your phone. We will have the time to go back and revisit some of these slides, but I want to just change the focus. I want to just go back to these periods, these 4 periods, and to be looking at the development of certain themes between the 1780s and the 1950s. And so the first theme is the justification for annexation. And so we might imagine that, so in the earlier sources, we've got mention of interest in connecting the Strait settlements with British India via the very, very deep water ports on the west coast, comparatively on the east coast. Shallow, sandy, all the sources show that all the navigation guides kind of complained about how bad the sandbars were getting up rivers and about how shallow the harbours were. So that was one justification. The other theme that's developed in my survey of the primary and secondary literature is the interest in securing free trade that required political stability. That was the second justification. The third, a bit later on, particularly as the strength of British presence in British Burma developed, there was mention of linking British Malaya, well, that's anachronistic. We shouldn't be using that term because that's too early, with British Burma. And in order to do that, we needed access to part of the peninsula. And I'll be telling you other reasons related to that, particularly on the west coast. There was also the agenda of preventing the southern spread of French influence. That was another justification. Fifthly, I might just want to add that particularly later on, late 19th century, people like vehemently anti-Siamese members of the colonial office, such as Swettingham, were mentioning the need for the British to protect the Malays in South Thailand against the cruel, corrupt, and incompetent Siamese colonizers. And I'll be talking about how the British perceived the Siamese and how the Siamese perceived themselves a bit later. Now, this led to before the Second World War, the justification of annexation on the basis of protecting the peninsula. And Operation Matador was before the First World War, and these ideas were revisited at the beginning of the Cold War. In between that, there was the justification of annexation on punishing the Siamese for their conduct during the Second World War. Okay, so that's the first justification. That's the first theme. The second theme that I was wanting to, that as I've been sitting on this and working through these periods and interacting with the range of institutions that these individuals worked in, from the Siamese side, from the British side, from the colonial office side, from the foreign office side, argy-bargy between British allies, French allies, is the theme of sponsors and spoilers of annexation. And I think that it's good for us to be reminding us that there was advocacy of annexation on more than just one side. We cannot, on the basis of the review of this period, to be saying that this was something that it was only the British that were interested in changing the political geography of the peninsula. We can't make that argument. The first was that there was a lack of agreement amongst the mercantile community as well as the bureaucrats, those sent by London, the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, to administer the growing territories and colonial interests that they had in this part of the world. We all know, and listen, again, I just want to say, listen, I'm at the history department of the University of Malaya. You guys know more about the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office than I do, but obviously these were not on the same page on a number of issues. This is another theme that develops as we review these time periods. There was also a lack of disagreement between Singapore and Bangkok. This is another development of the Foreign Office, Colonial Office not being on the same page. And also, again, want to reiterate that that British intervention was also sometimes at the request of Malay elites, and we've got a picture of Tunku Mahmud Mahidin and the Raja of Legeh and of Saiburi or Talupe or Talupan. And these happened in the late 19th century as well as the early 20th century. For example, the Raja of Legeh sent to Swinningham a gold cross, because Legeh had gold mines. He made a gold cross and he wrote a letter to the King of England via Frank Swinningham, who he had visited, and he specifically asked for the king to bring all of these Malay states under his kingdom, his rule. A remarkable anecdote. It's fun doing history because you see these funny little. It's just a little footnote in an article, but you follow the paper trail. Fascinating. The same theme of sponsors and spoilers are repeated in the Second World War, particularly between the British and the Americans, and the same is true in the Cold War period. I won't dwell on this, but this is something that I've enjoyed putting together, and I briefly wanted to show this. Now, what I need to do next is I need to actually make a list of all of the Siamese elites who were appointed as the Siamese ambassadors in the Siamese embassy in London. But on the left-hand side, I've got a list of the governors of the Straits settlements. Again, paying attention to the evolution of the colonial infrastructure between the British Straits settlements and the Colonial Office, from the 1820s particularly to the reign of Anderson, which corresponds roughly to the death of Chulalongkorn. And so these people were not all anti-Siamese, but some of them were very much so. Anyone who's interacted with the writings of Swinningham in the way that Datuk Henry Barlow has is very aware about how rabid he was in his anti-Siamese. He refused to use Thai place names. He never referred to Nakhon Tamarat. It was all the Go. Never Songkhla, Segogo. So and the claims that he made about what was going on, the ethnic makeup of the Upper South, displayed a profound lack of awareness of the size, the long history of Thai Buddhist communities in Nakhon Tamarat, the way that Nakhon Tamarat was one of the first centers of Buddhism before being spread further north. So completely clueless about so many things. Others were more moderate. I've enjoyed reading the interactions with Henry Ord, and who met the fifth reign of the Chakri dynasty. He went to an event to watch solar eclipse. They were both there together, and actually the king died on his way back to Bangkok after that. And Clark is also mentioned as being more moderate. But I think that as we interact between the primary and secondary sources, I think it's helpful that we do point out that that the Foreign Office, that the representatives of the Colonial Office in Singapore had to deal with representatives of the Foreign Office in Bangkok. And again, there is the indication of uneven personal and professional relationships between these people. And I do think it's important when we do analyze, I'll be talking about this later, but I think that when we are reconstructing a theme such as this, we do have to remind ourselves, I'll be talking a bit about some of my arguments, but basically it's an alternative to the conspiracy theories that we often hear. So this is an important contribution that I would like to make, and this will be part of the empirical contribution of the articles that I plan to be publishing as I disseminate the findings of this project. So let's go just very, very briefly. Sponsors and spoilers included Malay elites, and it's significant that the son of Tunku Abdul Qadir Gamaruddin on the left, he's standing with a rifle over a deer that he shot. There's some fascinating sources that reconstruct the interactions between Swetningham, Chulalongkorn and Abdul Qadir Gamaruddin. Now, there are some more Thai sources providing more details about Chulalongkorn's account of his difficult interactions with Swetningham in Singapore, which I need to do a bit more work on. But a generation later, after the Second World War, similar initiatives were made by his son, Tunku Mahmud Mahidin, who retired in Kelantan as a part of the Cold War realities. The freedom with which he was able to express his political views were curtailed by the changing security laws as part of the Malaysian emergency, and he was not able to be the agitator and advocate for Patani's incorporation into British Malaya. But there were a number of sponsors and spoilers. This is a lovely quote. This is a quote, Roosevelt to Churchill. Winston, this is something which you just do, which you are just not able to understand. You have 400 years of acquisitive instinct in your blood, and you just don't understand how a country might not want to acquire land somewhere if they can get it. A new period has opened in the world's history, and you will have to adjust to it. So this was a source of no small exasperation. I'm going to just speed up. I'm almost done with my 45 minutes, and I'm going to be speeding up because I do want to respect the time given. But I want to just mention one of the main things that I've been doing as I've been analysing this period, and it has to do with cartography and perceptions of the peninsula, specifically in colonial atlases produced by British publishers. And these relate to the perception of the peninsula. Very briefly, example of colonial cartographic craftiness develops in the post 1824. You'll see here the boundary, the southern boundary of Tenasserim in southern Burma, being deliberately misrepresented as being Phuket. And this appears in more than one place. Okay, now, just because it appears in more than one place basically means in these days, you know, there there were templates used for maps, and people repeated ad infinitum. But at some stage, someone may have mistakenly drawn the boundary there, but we don't know about how intentional that was. So we do need to be careful that we don't jump for the conspiracy theory. Ha ha, evil British colonialists wanting to take over the peninsula. I do think we need to talk about the cock-up theories, the foul-up theories. So that's the first observation about what the cartographic material says. And the other is this. And the other is actually more interesting and compelling. There are a number of ways that British maps represent and imagine the cultural geography of the peninsula. And we see a development in the 19th century of the Malay portion of the peninsula appearing a lot further north than we would normally assume that to be. Now, there are significant Malay communities up the west coast all the way to the southern border. So the last census of Monton Phuket in 1917 claimed that 30% of that Monton were Malays. And they may have been related to the internally displaced people as a result of the campaigns of the Siamese in the 1830s. So, but it is significant that later on in the 19th century, we see the Malay portion of the peninsula being way, way north of Patani, which is usually considered to be around the time when the Malay zone and the Thai-dominated zone transitions. Just going on, okay, we won't have time to talk about that. Those are the statistics that I referred to just now. But another theme in the cartography is the appearance of references to the British sphere of influence in British maps. And so this map is 4 years after the secret convention between the Thais, as we call them now, and the British. And the point there, you see the red dot on the east coast of the peninsula. This is the part of the peninsula specifically referred to in this treaty. But later on, we have a number of British maps specifically refer to British spheres of influence. So, for example, in 1907, there is a British map, and you can't see it particularly well, but the insert in black and white, the 1907 map, there is a reference to the part of present-day Patani, Yala and Naratiwa being under this British sphere of influence. And these continue after the Anglo-Siamese Treaty of 1909. With the 1913, we've got references to the British sphere of influence there as well. So there are a number of ways of analysing this. Moving on, I briefly want to mention the development of concessions. So there was a development from an interest in free trade to an interest in free land. Not free, but very, very cheap. And we need to remind ourselves about when these developments were happening. So here is a summary of all the concessions given to British, French, Italian, Japanese, Russian and Germans following the demise of the Qing dynasty in 1850. I've put the names there. Some of these ports include obviously Hong Kong, which was 1842, but this was the century of concessions. So we talk a lot about the scramble for Africa. This was a time when people were thinking, goody gumdrops, cheap land, thank you very much. And this was one of a number of syndicates that was proposed during the 1890s, the Malay Peninsula Exploration Syndicate. We haven't got time to mention all of the names, but they included Reed, who was a very well-known merchant in Singapore, and Stahl, who was the Foreign Office representative in Bangkok. So there's a number of historians that have analysed interactions. And Stahl commented, I can't remember what year it was. Was it 1891? The English people no longer content themselves with territories they can make use of themselves. They've begun to
collect in tropical countries for the benefit of Asiatics, chiefly Chinese and Klings, who flock together wherever the easygoing colonial official sets up business for the colonial man is quite different sort from the Indian office official, such much less of a benevolent despot, not as to benevolence, but as to despotism. So that's a lovely anecdote. That did not go well. Henry's made mention of the role, the way in which Swinningham got his exasperation out of his skin, off his chest, by writing anonymous articles to the Blackwoods magazine, and this is a consistent theme as we survey this long period. And I want to mention the interesting work of Davies, who wrote for the Straits Times. He visited South Thailand, published a number of articles in the Straits Times, and then republished it as a monograph, Siam, in the Malaysian Peninsula. Barbara Swinningham-Jones was invited famously by a number of Anglophile Malay elites to go to South Thailand to see the state of the Malays following the surrender of the Japanese and the new governments in Bangkok, and she wrote a number of articles advocating for the Malays. Okay, that's a romp through, and I'm just going to take 2 minutes now. Henry, the so what? Okay, so what? Why is this important? Okay, the first is this, and this first relates to my comment about the Treaty of Waitangi. There is a need to put scholarship to work. And that research and publishing what actually happened plays an important part in serving peaceful efforts to move forward in what we can confidently refer to as an intractable conflict in South Thailand. When we don't tell the truth, when we don't stick to the sources, when we don't report on all of the bad behaviour on all parts, you know, we provide oxygen for conspiracy theories. And so there is a real need for this sort of research if we are going to see a peaceful resolution of this conflict in South Thailand. The other is of enormous contemporary relevance. This very, very quick survey of developments between the 1780s and the 1950s brings into focus that local ethno-nationalistic aspirations are impacted by global geopolitics, the best example of which is the Americans and the Brits just saying, listen, you're not going to do this for these reasons. So there's a new time starting, you know, we've made these charters, we've got the Atlantic Charter, the Cairo Convention, you know, San Francisco Conventions, and, you know, the best example of this legacy is in the Middle East with Palestine. There are certain things that the big boys won't allow to be revisited, and particularly in the story of annexation of the peninsula, global geopolitics impacted decisions in the post-Second World War period and in the early Cold War. But the decisive period was in 1900, 1901, 1902. I also, and I hope I haven't offended anyone, in New Zealand we wouldn't call the cock-up theory to be a rude, it would be rustic. But I mean, on the basis of what the primary and secondary sources tell us, I think it's good for us to be talking about getting beyond the conspiracy theories. The people in Singapore, the people in Penang were not given carte blanche, you know, they weren't given an open check to do whatever you like. There were checks and balances. Governors changed, heads of the foreign offices changed, and British consuls in Bangkok changed, governors changed, and that led in many cases to certain good decisions not being made and certain bad decisions being made. And also it's good for us to be comparing the entrepreneurs with the pragmatists. And again, I'm confident that people who've studied the history of these Siamese-Malay states know more about these interactions than I do. Siam did not perceive itself as Great Britain's rival. And this was the reason why Swettenham really he hated dealing with the Siamese. Because they did not, I mean, you know, he was used to dealing with Asian counterparts who had to kowtow to him. With the Siamese did not perceive themselves as being victims, they perceived themselves as being rivals. Now, this is an argument of Tamara Luce in her excellent book, Subject Siam, which develops this idea of competitive colonialisms that I've used. There's also, and I really think this is important that we talk about this, there's also, it's good that we remind ourselves about why, what the reference to honour, this was Jutta Longkong's comment in his journal, that it would be a lack of honour to the kingdom if these states were lost. Because this is a reminder that on certain topics, we cannot be rational. We do not act rationally. So whether we are a Thai ethno-nationalist or a Malay ethno-nationalist or a white supremacist, there are certain topics. I mean, if you're a father and you've got a daughter, there are certain issues with your daughter you cannot be rational about. We must remember that when we are talking about these issues. A good reminder is that British annexation was actually sought by some Malay elites at certain times. And that my very brief mention of the significance of certain entrepreneurs using print media to impact public opinion is an interesting prelude to the role that social media plays in doing exactly the same. And as a primarily, well, actually I was going to say, I bounce between Thai studies and Malay studies. And this sort of project reminds me that silos between Thai study specialists and Malay study specialists, they do not serve us well. And I think that we need to replace silos with synergy. And I've gone over time and I do apologize, but that is everything that I've prepared to say. So thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. And I'm sure that there will be quite a number of questions. I'm not quite sure how you indicate that in the audience online that you wish to put a question, but I see that David Alfred has put his hand up. So should we start with him? Over to you, David.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Doctor, you have displayed such a vast array of knowledge of this area, stretching over 3 centuries. I thought that it would be best if I cut to the chase, just ask you about the relations between Thailand, Malaya, and the United Kingdom. From what you say, it is clear that the Siamese king, who was the king in 1909, when the Anglo-Siamese Treaty was signed, whereby the Bunga Mas was ended, that what was created thereafter, insofar as the 4 northern Malay states were concerned, was that they became independent of both Britain and Siam. And in proof of this, I offer you the leading constitutional case of Duff Development Corporation
Yes.
and Sultan of Kelantan, where a certain gentleman who was there on the Prince of Wales in August 1941, and who was then the colonial secretary, one Winston Churchill, had to write in his capacity as the colonial secretary to tell the English High Court that His Majesty's government recognizes the Sultan of Kelantan as the sovereign of an independent state. So this leads to the question, why then, when 1941 arrived and the British minister in Bangkok, Josiah Crosby, was so adamant that Britain should not invade the Kra Isthmus that he effectively neutered Operation Matador, which had already been neutered by Winston Churchill, dismissing Brooke Popham as the Supreme British Commander and appointing Henry Pownell. So with the non-intervention of the British and their defeat on the 15th of February 1942, why then would the Siamese, who I consider as a non-compliant equal of the United Kingdom, why then did they accept with such, I don't know what word to use, was it with elan, the handing over of the 4 northern states by Tojo in October 1943? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, listen. Yeah. I mean, it sounds on the basis of what the ease at which you're able to make reference to all of those people and all those dates. I think that you probably know this area better than I do. I don't know. Maybe I don't really like being the kind of academic that just because he knows a lot about something thinks he knows a lot about everything. So I think that I'm not sure whether I've got that much more to add than what you have done. I think that what I might just say is that well before the Second World War, there was significant diplomatic contact between Siam and Japan. And this was related to the high regard that many people under colonial rule had for Japan because of their defeat of the Russians. So I've researched the number of the international relations between Bangkok and a number of Western and Asian powers, and there was significant Japanese investment in Thailand. There were trade treaties. This is in the secondary literature. A number of trade treaties between Bangkok and Tokyo were made. There's some interesting references to significant. There was a Japanese consulate established in Songkhla in the 1930s. My neighbor in Patani, his aunt had married a Japanese soldier who had lived in Patani in the 1930s and had married, she was Pakistani. This Japanese soldier had married this Pathan woman, had converted to Islam in Patani and had worked as a doctor in Patani, but was also a spy and had provided the Japanese with all of the details required for the invasion of Patani. So there was a lot of, all I can say is that, there's quite a lot of, the only way I can contribute is to say, well, there are some other materials specifically about Japanese getting themselves in place in the 1930s. But I don't know if I could add any more to your understanding. I hope that that's okay.
Well, thank you, Doctor.
Next question. Anybody like to put up their hand? Don't see any hands on the screen. Anybody here?
Chris, you didn't touch on one of my personal pet subjects, which is the role of the shortage of rice after World War II. which also constrained the British. You've touched rightly on the OSS influence and so on. But it has occurred to me, if we had annexed southern Thailand, was it enough of the rice in southern Thailand for us to use?
The answer is no. The vast majority, comparatively, southern Thailand was very, very sparsely populated. And if we look at the work done by economic historians, it's central Thailand. It's all produced in central and in North Thailand. And so they had an enormous store because they weren't able to sell rice during the Second World War. And they had an enormous store. Again, there are certain sub-stories that have been dealt with by others. Hugh Wilson's work is the most important. So basically what happened was that as the British and the American allies negotiated about how the Siamese would fare, there was an awareness of the importance of Thailand's stockpile of rice to feeding British colonies, and there was an indication made by the Siamese that if the British were willing to cut them a bit of slack, that they may not find that they would be willing to sell the rice to them. And these Nicholas Tarling, Hugh Wilson have dealt with those in great detail, and I would just suggest that just go and read those, and I can send those to you. No problem. But that was it's an important sub-theme and sub-story. But they wouldn't have been able to feed people if they had annexed that portion of the peninsula. It was tin, it was rubber. It was tin and rubber down there.
Thank you very much. Anybody else got any questions or comments? I've got one. First of all, a comment. You point out that at certain times the Patani Malays were desperate to get into Malaya, and at the same time, I'm not sure that the candidates for the Sultancy of Perak at the time of the Pankor engagement would have felt exactly in the same way about it, because they were basically not just cajoled, but driven into it under fairly uncomfortable circumstances. I wonder whether there's any indication that any of the candidates for the Sultancy in Perak were in touch with the Patani Malays. And my second question is, you showed an illustration of the Gempar badge, which curiously combined the British Crown, the Union Jack, and symbols of Malaya in a couple of krisis, which were subsequently basically adopted by UMNO. Is there any indication that this had any circulation within the peninsula, or was it strictly confined to the Thai provinces?
This is really interesting. Okay, so first of all, most generalizations are only generally true. I am not aware of any documentary evidence about contact between present and former members of the Istana in Patani with Perak. I think that the Sultan of Rahman, the former Sultan of Rahman, whose demise paralleled in terms of circumstances and timing, his demise in Rahman was around the same time, 1890s, early 20th century. The Sultan of Perak and Rahman didn't get on particularly well because of the territorial disputes that they had from, was it 1899? The 1899 was the boundary agreement between Rahman, and so I'm not aware of there being a good relationship between the Sultan of Rahman and Perak, and I haven't come across any reliable references to the last Sultan of Patani, Sultan Tunku Abdul Qadir Kamarudin, been in contact with Perak at all. I think they had far more contact with Kelantan because they were direct relatives. They were marrying each other's, cousins. The royal families had a number of connections with each other. I think that my assumption is that the Sultan of Kelantan would have passed on to people the imperfections of his position under the British following 1909, and I assume that that did not dissuade the son of the last Sultan of Patani, Tunku Mahmud Mahidin, deciding, I would rather deal with that imperfection than with the imperfection of Bangkok. So that would be my response to your first question. You'd have to remind me what your second was.
The use of the Gunpowder badge.
Oh yes. Okay, good. So I think this is. I mean, oh my goodness, this is another article. So I think it's really significant that in addition to in the post-war period, we see, the Washington and England kind of coming to an agreement about how they're going to deal with Thailand. You've got 7 governments in 6 months in Thailand that were resolved with the return of a fascist leader that coincided with the Malayan emergency that required cooperation between Bangkok and the British. You see what I'm getting at? And so the other significant development during this time, which impacted the royal family in Patani, is that the Malayan Union was established. And central to the Malayan Union was what? It was the marginalization of royal elites, which we can imagine. I mean, that was the zeitgeist in which attempts by former members of the royal household in Patani may have been viewed by the British and the Americans and the Siamese as being a really bit about out of date, isn't it? Our bottom line is against communism. We're not friends, but we're no longer enemies. Let's concentrate on not having a repeat of the invasion of the peninsula by the Japanese by people wearing more red than the others. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for those comments. If there are, yes, question here.
My name is Randy. I'm the PhD candidate of Department of History, University of Malaya. Because my personal interest, on the railway in the Peninsula Malaya, also, I tried to link to maybe the interconnection of the railway of the Peninsula Malaya side into the southern part of the peninsula. The Siamese settlement. So I think maybe in the early 20th century, I don't know whether Dr. Christopher had some findings on the disputes or discussion on the building of the railway in between, the police or Kedah, and then linking into the Hat Yai, and then did they had some finding, or some dispute on the infrastructure development, for example, railways, between the Siamese and the British in that.
Yeah. So I'm not wearing my Superman suit today. Didn't think that would be appropriate. So I'm afraid that my hard drive is full and the battery's down and my RAM isn't enough. So I can't dredge up all the information. I've kind of been concentrating firstly on East Coast developments and East Coast developments south of Songkhla. And so if you read the work done on the terms of the Anglo-Siamese Treaty of 1909, there was reference to, I think after that there were loans given to Bangkok, or there were partnership agreements between British companies and Siamese to develop a rail infrastructure after 1909. But I'm afraid I don't have all the dates in my head. I was just having lunch with Mala Satyan, who's teaches at the Southeast Asian Studies Department, and she mentioned that she's done some work on that. But this is not a particular area of interest to mine. But what I do have is I've got some great Thai sources from the British consul in Singora or Songkhla in 1909, and there's a Thai source written in 1909. The Thais talk about the development and the roading in Monton, Patani in 1909. The British consul stationed in Songkhla writes something like, roads in the western sense of the word don't exist in South Thailand. And then he makes a lovely list of how many hours it takes to get from one town to the other, how many days. So, but this revolutionized the South in all sorts of ways. But we can talk about this a bit later on, and I'll see what I can dredge up. Yeah. I guess this is another way of me saying I don't really know anything about developments between Hadyai and Butterworth. So I'm more of a specialist on the East Coast and yeah, in the present Patani, Yala, Narati, Wat provinces. So I can tell you more about what's happening south between Tumpat, Golok and Hadyai. Yeah, but we can chat later. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. I think time is moving on, and probably this is a suitable moment to bring the meeting to a close. So on behalf of both the attendees here and those who have attended online, may I express our warmest thanks and appreciation to you, Chris, for a fascinating presentation and some quite stimulating discussion afterwards. And as a small token of our appreciation, may I give you a copy of one of our MBRAS publications, Shaya Perang Perak.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll enjoy reading that.
Good.
Very kind. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So those who are around who would like to have a further discussion with Chris, please feel free to come along and have a chat. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all attendees. Good afternoon or good night as appropriate. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Chris?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Go for it.
Now, can we reorientate to your subject matter, which is the British annexation of southern Siam, northern Malaya? And if we go back a little in history, and we go back to Chinese New Year Day on the 15th of February, 1942, when the sun set on the British Empire in that part of the world, the Malayan Planning Unit was set up, I think, in Kew Garden in the following year, and it was headed by one Edward Gent. And if my memory serves me correct, the first thing he did was that he thought that the Siamese government should be punished by the British annexing the southern Thai provinces, Patani, and etc., and incorporating it into what was loosely termed British Malaya. Now, the reason why he failed was that Roosevelt, who had died in April 1945, had been succeeded by Truman, and as the Americans say, center on the plate of Truman after 1946, going on to 1947, when a very significant event occurred, which reverberates to this very hour on this day. It was as plain as a pikestaff to Truman that he was not going to allow the British to annex the southern provinces of Siam, because that would cause Siam not to join the ranks of countries like Liberia in West Africa and the Philippines in Southeast Asia, and support the United Nations to support the United States in the United Nations resolution in 1947 of the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine into Israel and Palestine. So was that the reason why the British could not annex southern Thailand? Because the Americans would not allow it. And to conclude, Edward Gent was given the poison chalice of becoming the first governor of the Malayan Union on April Fool's Day, 1st April 1946, where he, having presided over the creation of the Malayan Union, then kept his career by presiding over its premature liquidation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer, David, is, if you don't mind me, excuse the informality, is
perfectly all right.
The simple answer is that, yeah, I mean, the Americans weren't able to solicit the agreement of their American allies to annex the Malay majority Patani states. There'd been a number of points of tension right from 1943, where after the signing of the Atlantic Charter, the Siamese, the British avoided writing specific statements of their position of Siamese sovereignty, and they dragged their feet, and this was a source of tension. There was, again, with the presence of I've just had a Chiang Kai-shek, his presence at the Cairo conference. Again, that was another source of tension between him as a representative of the nationalists in China, the Americans, with the British. This was a low-level source of tensions. Everyone knew that the British, what the British had in mind, because they had, despite having signed the Atlantic Treaty, they had prevaricated on making specific statements about their position on Siamese sovereignty. So there was one lot who said that the Siamese had broken non-aggression pacts signed before the war, and that there was a declaration of war specifically on Britain and France. France was more, they were really strong about declaring war on France because of the difficult history that had. And if you know the history, you know that by contrast, the Siamese ambassador, the Thai ambassador in Washington, was sent a telegram by Bangkok informing him that he had to go and declare war in Washington, and the American intelligence agencies managed to intercept this. And they went and visited him, and they said, you've received a telegram from Bangkok, and we're assuming that you don't want to deliver it. We'd like to ask you to form a government in exile. So right from the start of the Japanese invasion, there were American-based ties that were co-opted by the Americans, and there were British merchants with a long background, good relationship with elites in Bangkok, and there were some Thai elites that were in the UK at the declaration of war. And so it's all very fascinating, but I do hope that I don't have to deal with all those. I mean, yeah, so basically the Americans vetoed the British going ahead with their plans because they didn't want for their colonies to expand as a result of the cessation of hostilities during the Second World War. Yeah.
Thank you.